Say hello, folks. Our event will begin in just a moment as soon as we give people about a minute to join.
I think we can begin now. This is Sanford Ungar. I'm director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. And I hope our audio is turned on now. I'm delighted to welcome our participants to this Free Speech Workshop Forum of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown. And we're talking today about the future of free speech, the condition of free speech in America after the 2020 presidential election, which most of us assume has been settled. And there are a few holdouts, I suppose, but we're going to assume that the election has been resolved and that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. I have two panelists with me this afternoon, Nadine Strossen, who is the John Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School in New York City, and I am former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, I believe for 17 years, Nadine. Some other time, someone ought to talk to you about how you hold that job for 17 years. You're muted at the moment, Nadine.
I'm eager to jump in and say it was almost 18 years.
Okay.
I sweated for every single minute of it. Thank you, Sandy.
And Ron Collins, who is the former professor of law at University of Washington in Seattle, and I would have to say one of the great experts on the First Amendment. Ron, you are the editor-in-chief of First Amendment News. How often is that published?
It comes out weekly, every Wednesday, to a couple of thousand First Amendment lawyers, professors, journalists, and others. And it's free, so anybody can go to it, First Amendment News.
So you're the go-to person to understand the condition of the First Amendment, and I think the obvious person that we want to hear from about where things stand with the Supreme Court as we approach the beginning of the Biden administration. 6-3 presumed conservative majority, but there is no particular reason to be sure that conservative majority has a specific meaning for free speech. Can you tell us where things stand as we begin?
Well, first of all, thank you. And what a delight it is to be here with my longtime friend, Nadine. And by the way, I always like to say it, I'm a card-carrying member. That's actually, I have a card in my wallet. And I think my dues are up to date of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm happy to be a small part of all the wonderful things they do.
And my fan dues are up to date.
Okay. And Sandy, we go back a ways, and what a joy it is to be here with you. So thank you. So just a couple of things in a nutshell. I'm going to be necessarily abbreviated here.
Ron, I don't know if other people may be having the same problem I have, but your volume is low.
Okay.
You may need to be closer to the microphone.
All right, sure. I hope this is better.
It is better.
So a couple of things. The Roberts Court in a nutshell. So John Roberts has been on the court since 2005. So we have 15 years. In those 15 years, 56 First Amendment. By First Amendment, I mean speech, press, petition, assembly, not religion. That's free exercise and establishment. So 56 First Amendment free speech cases have been decided. In those cases, 95% of the time, 95% of the time, John Roberts assigns the opinion. That's because he's in the majority. So, and who's written the most First Amendment opinions? John Roberts. And which segment of the court is least important only when it comes to assignment of opinions? In those 56 opinions, the 3 women on the court, that is before Justice Ginsburg passed, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan, they wrote about 9%. In other words, 6 of those 56 majority opinions were written by 3 women in total. So when it comes to the First Amendment, apart from their dissents, which are obviously important, in terms of majority opinions, they're not players. Much the same thing could be said for the liberal members of the court, the male liberal Justice Breyer. So that's the first thing. John Roberts pretty much controls that docket. And if you want to win a First Amendment case, you better make sure that you're pitching your case to John Roberts.
So that's very interesting. So if I can interrupt you for a second. Sure. So when Supreme Court litigators are arguing their cases, there's a good chance that they have in mind trying to get through to Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah. I mean, he surpasses everybody, including Anthony Kennedy. I mean, people thought that Anthony Kennedy was the First Amendment go-to person. That was true before John Roberts came on the court. But since he's there, you lose John Roberts, and that means that the chances in terms of the cases we've studied, 56, the chances about 5% of prevailing. And so he's really essential. What are the cases that are important to the Roberts Court? When I say important, when they use the First Amendment to strike down a law. So campaign finance. They've never seen a campaign finance law that they've liked. You know, unconstitutional, unconstitutional, unconstitutional. Commercial speech, corporate commercial speech. More often than not, corporations involved in commercial speech, selling tobacco, what have you, alcohol, those cases tend to prevail. Union fees. The First Amendment is used regularly, quite frequently, to strike down union fee cases on the grounds that that constitutes compelled speech. What does the liberal wing, how do they see this? As far as Elena Kagan says it, this is weaponizing the First Amendment for the powerful, weaponizing the First Amendment for corporations, weaponizing the First Amendment for the advantage, as I said, of the powerful. So that's the kind of the nutshell. Just in terms of where we're going, I think I could say a lot more, but let me just end on this note. I think the big question going forward, among others, is going to be the conflict between religious freedom and equality. And I think we're going to see more and more free speech and free exercise cases being brought to cut back on various aspects of equality. I'll give you an example. Remember the case of the baker who refused to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, all right? That's one example. There's a case before the court now involving a florist who refuses to make a bouquet for a gay couple.
That's in Washington State, I believe.
That's Washington State is coming for the Supreme Court. What if a gay couple went to a bed and breakfast and the proprietor said, we're sorry, you know, this is contrary to our religious conscience. So I think that's one line of cases we're going to be seeing a lot of going forward. I could say more, but let me just stop there and open it up.
Well, I will want Nadine to jump in on this next question as well. So from what you've described, the First Amendment philosophy, as it were, of Chief Justice Roberts, the list that you give would be regarded by many people as conservative uses of free speech, corporate speech, striking down election reform laws, which we know have upset many liberals, though they were free speech opinions. Does that mean that there's a conservative filter on the Roberts Court's view of free speech? Either one.
I'd love to hear what Ron's got the statistics, and then I'll chime in.
So very quickly, yes and no. So yes, in the obvious case, you know, when it comes to union fees, good luck winning those cases. When it comes to campaign finance case, almost highly unlikely that they're going to lose. But I have to say that in some of the court's so-called trivial cases, for example, cases involving video games or what have you, the bar, which applies beyond these trivial cases, the bar for protecting free speech is very high. And that goes to the benefit of everybody. So in that respect, the Roberts Court is also very protective of free speech. So it's kind of a little bit of both.
Yeah, and I wanted to say in the vast majority of cases, what's at stake is a neutral principle that will redound to the benefit of anybody, no matter who they are, no matter what their ideas are. And so the court has overwhelmingly supported speech that is controversial and unpopular and disliked and vaguely feared by denying the government power to suppress speech on that basis. The court is protecting dissidents and advocates and crusaders for reform. To cite one very recent example, which was not resolved on First Amendment grounds, but is likely to have a pro-speech impact for Black Lives Matter in the D. Ray McKesson case, in which the ACLU is representing that leader of the Black Lives Matter movement. He was held liable for enormous damages for an assault against a police officer by an unknown member of a demonstration that he happened to be addressing. And this was in Louisiana. This is very reminiscent of the tactic that was used during the civil rights movement to try to suppress civil rights advocates by holding them liable for any kind of violence that might occur during demonstrations. So protection of free speech really redounds to
but he was held liable. He was held liable in a lower court,
right?
And the Supreme Court has reversed that decision.
It sent it back to the lower court to explore whether, in fact, he should even have been held liable under state tort law. So, you know, it was not resolved yet expressly on First Amendment grounds, but obviously an effort to protect the speaker's rights. And with respect to, you know, for example, the Supreme, I'm sorry, I do want to add one point in support of negative view of how they're exercising their discretion in these cases, which is when you think of people who are within government institutions, the court has not been protective. So while paying lip service to the landmark free speech case for students and teachers, Tinker versus Des Moines, ACLU case, I'm proud to say, the court has construed it very narrowly to not allow free speech for students who are engaging in controversial expression. Same thing for organizations that are providing humanitarian assistance to organizations that the United States State Department has branded as terrorist organizations. The court has, over very strong dissent in both of these cases, not allowed even advocacy, even of education and reconciliation. So there are some, you know, one might see a pattern of too much deference to government in some cases, but overall, I would say it is very speech protective of neutral principles that can be used and have been used for advocates of human rights.
I would just, I totally agree with Nadine when it comes to government speech. If you work for the government, practically speaking, you have few, if any, rights to speak, even when you're speaking outside, outside of your government position, although the law seems to grant you some liberty there. So that's one thing. Student speech, again, as Nadine pointed out, a case that the American Civil Liberties Union lost, unfortunately, 5-4 about support to controversial groups. So there is, I don't know that I would feel comfortable using phrase like neutral principles, but because there is clearly a divide. I mean, there's clearly a divide in the court. I think the larger point, one that Nadine made, and I'm happy to echo, is that the free speech that's granted, even in these trivial cases, largely accrues to the benefit of many people. And I think that's a good thing. One last point. In all of this, let us not lose sight of the fact that within the American Civil Liberties Union, including as recent as last week, there is a huge debate going on about free speech. And, you know, we could get to that in a moment when we get to cancel culture. But, you know, even among progressives, this whole debate about whether or not speech can be used as a weapon against the powerless is a debate that's very much alive in liberal circles, including the American Civil Liberties Union.
I think that a lot of people are wondering if it comes to the court. There have been so many efforts by the executive branch at the federal level to do something about protests, the wave of protests in this year in particular. And one wonders what the fate of those protesters are liable to be with the current Supreme Court. We all like to say that the right to protest is very fundamental, right to present grievances, to oppose government, to be in the, and this past weekend in Washington, there was a very disappointing armed confrontation in the streets. People arrested, weapons seized, some weapons charges, one person stabbed 3 times, promoting I would say, strengthening the Trump administration's argument, the departing Trump administration's argument, that many of these protests, even though the one side here was supporting him, that they're violent, that they're a threat to property, they're a threat to law and order. Where does all that stand? Not just at the Supreme Court, but where do we think that stands in American jurisprudence at the moment?
Here I can speak because I've been following a lot of the ACLU lawsuits, and they have been all over the country, Sandy, because unfortunately, there has been at least as much police violence and in some cases, including Washington, D.C., even military force used inappropriately against peaceful, law-abiding, not only protesters, but also journalists, legal observers, and medics, all of whom are exercising First Amendment rights that are at the core of our democracy. And I'm happy to report that we have, as far as I know, an unbroken string of wins all over the country, which is kind of a sad commentary on how much violation of rights there's been. There's been a little bit of a struggle to ensure that the government officials actually comply with court orders to cease and desist from violating rights of peaceful protesters. So sometimes we've had to go back to court to seek contempt orders. Here, the Supreme Court jurisprudence is very supportive. And I would say the problem, as it often is not the law in the abstract, but is it actually honored and respected and enforced at the ground level? You asked exactly the right question.
The thing I would add to that, I agree 100% with what Nadine said, but I think the conversation—
Ron, I have to ask you to get closer to the computer again. I'm sorry.
I agree entirely with what Nadine said. I just think we have to add something to it. And to echo at least the thought of Martin Luther King, it is incumbent upon us, those of us who defend the right to protest, and I emphasize protest peacefully, it is incumbent upon us to speak out and speak loudly and speak often and condemn violence, condemn looting, condemn firebombing, condemn vandalizing. And I think in this respect, much to my regret, I think too many liberals have been too silent too often. It is one thing to vigorously protest and to have that protest defended. And I think the American Civil Liberties Union, better than any other group, has been at the vanguard for decades and continues to be to this day. But I do feel uncomfortable, particularly what I see with going on sometimes in Portland. This is not to say that there aren't all sorts of excesses, police excesses, particularly with the federal government. but there's a certain type of anarchy, violent anarchy, that just cannot be. We cannot remain silent about it, and this is as much a cultural problem as anything else. So that's the only thing I would add to that.
But I agree with Ron, but at the other end of the spectrum, we have too much guilt by association, where the overwhelming majority of protesters who are exercising the right to peaceably assemble, and that word is in the First Amendment itself, are being guilted by association because of the few violent ones. And the D. Ray McKesson case epitomized that. He had absolutely no causal responsibility or even knowledge about the violence and being held culpable for it.
So the question is, who do we blame for that? Obviously, we blame, and rightfully blame, government and police overreaching, all right? But we should also condemn the people that were engaged in the unlawful, unpeaceful, violent action that gave rise to that. And I think in this respect, forgive me, I just feel that progressives have been too silent too often about that. Again, I'm totally concerned about the excesses of police force and what have you, particularly in minority communities. But that's the only thing I would add.
You know, Ron, a lot of people would say that President Trump was successful in exploiting the relative reticence of progressives and liberals, by some definition, during the campaign, and that might be one explanation for the odd results, that although Trump loses, a lot of Democrats do not win in the legislative elections, in the down ballot elections. The defunding the police slogan, for example, was a catastrophe for Democratic candidates.
One example, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the name, not that it matters, but a commentator, an analyst who quoted a report a study that had been done by a Black social scientist at Princeton University, suggesting that violent protests in the past had resulted in adverse electoral results for Democrats, and that person was subject to all kinds of criticism, and I believe actually fired for having dared to make this kind of suggestion that Ron is making now, referring to a social science study.
Well, I think the extension, unfortunately, is that there have been a lot of examples of hostility toward Black protesters, toward Black Lives Matter protesters. And I think if I were a participant in those demonstrations, I would say that there was a threat to my free speech, to my ability peaceably to present my grievances as explained in the First Amendment by people. Some of these well-publicized instances of people standing outside with automatic weapons as they go by, exercising what are perhaps their recognized Second Amendment rights, but in confrontation with people exercising their First Amendment rights. And I'm not sure the picture looks too good from a national perspective on behalf of the protesters at the moment, perhaps in part because of what Ron has just suggested. I wonder, just again, a kind of overview before we get down into some of the details. And by the way, I want to stress to our participants that you have a Q&A, you should have a Q&A button with your Zoom link. And if you have questions at any time, please file them in the Q&A link and they will eventually be transmitted to me, to us, and we will present the questions of some of the other people participating to our panelists. But what do you think is going to be overall the difference that the Biden administration has a chance to make on the overall protection of free speech in the days ahead? What you were saying before, both of you, about deference to the government and dissenters within government, will there be some improvement in the legal picture for whistleblowers, for example, which has not been, who have not been very well protected until now?
I'm really not aware of campaign statements on point. Again, I don't believe in guilt by association, but the Obama administration, of which Joe Biden was part, was notoriously terrible about whistleblowers. The most frightening statement, which I think deals with the most pressing issue of free speech, is Joe Biden's threat to try to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and to stifle the freedom of internet intermediaries to engage in content moderation, which in turn would have an enormously speech suppressive impact on everybody who is using or trying to use social media to reach a general public. This is something where there was no difference between Biden and Trump. They both disliked Section 230. They both disliked how internet intermediaries are exercising their power, although for completely different reasons. And I think we have to be very, very careful about any trimming back of a law that has disincentivized stifling messages of the rest of us who use access to those platforms to realize the potential communicative power of the internet.
Ron, did you want to answer the immediate question? I wasn't planning to go into social media just yet, but I think Nadine has taken us there and we should do that. But do you have a comment about whistleblowers and the record of Democratic versus Republican administrations on that point?
Well, just very quickly, I completely agree. It's so I love being with Nadine because we can always kind of flesh these issues out. I mean, the fact is that the Obama administration was not good. They were really bad when it came to whistleblowers. Not that the Trump administration has been anything great. So, that's the thing. We can talk more about Section 230. By the way, the latest statements coming from the Biden administration is that they're calling on reforms, not canceling or revoking it.
Right. Before we leave that other point, though, it is true that the Obama administration, and especially Attorney General Eric Holder, brought more cases under the Espionage Act than all other, and these are not espionage cases, these are cases against journalists for the most part, or government employees, more than all previous administrations combined. And so that was not a shining part of the record. But let's go to the issue of Section 230. And for those who are participating who don't know exactly what it is and what its impact is, this was a clause, Section 230 to be precise, in the Communications Decency Act, I believe of 1994, if I'm not mistaken. 96, thank you, Nadine. That made it clear that the social media platforms could not be held responsible for what others said on social media. Do I have that right?
With a couple big exceptions, namely federal crimes or intellectual property.
Right. But 26 words, as the experts say, that essentially banned censorship from the internet or suppression of speech on the internet. And of course, it's under attack and blamed for many things right now, including by Ted Cruz and other prominent Republicans. There is a strong attack on this because of what they allege is partisanship of the social media. And President Trump has said that himself. So what are the pros and cons of keeping or obliterating or indeed reforming Section 230?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. And I'm just going to push back a little bit on something you just said, Sandy. It's not just Republicans, it's Democrats.
Of course it is, yes.
Tomorrow, the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, will be testifying before Congress. And the liberals are very concerned, and understandably so, about anti-Muslim bigotry. on Facebook and Twitter are are pushing for a number of the quote unquote same reforms that the conservatives are, although for different reasons, is the first thing. The second thing is, let us not speak falsely now. Section 230 is not a constitutional right, all right? It's something that the Congress, and I think by and large in its wisdom, gave to internet service providers to allow for a greater freedom of exchange of ideas and what have you. This isn't to say that it's not rife with problems, and perhaps some talk about reform when it comes to transparency, some talk about reform when it talks about voluntary content moderation is not such a bad thing after all. I will only add one more point, although much could be said about this. Anybody that watched 60 Minutes last night saw that there was a segment about TikTok, all right? I'm very concerned as an American about the Chinese government, all right, having access to my data if I'm a user of TikTok. Now, to say that, you know, the government can't somehow have some role here to play to protect the data of Americans and what have you, I think is something very important to keep in mind. And I'll only add one more thing. You know, there's a lot of race hate speech on the internet, a lot of false speech. And this brings us back to something that
on the internet, you mean?
Yes, and on the social platforms. And this brings back to something Justice Holmes said in his dissent in Abrams versus United States, a 1919 dissent, a very important First Amendment case. And he said that free speech, the idea of free speech, is an experiment, like life is an experiment. Sometimes experiments fail, all right? And we have to, as a culture, be mindful of the fact that when we roll the dice, when we allow this much bigotry and this much falsehood into the marketplace, it's entirely possible that the experiment may fail. Does this mean that we should deny First Amendment rights? Perhaps not. But it certainly means that we can't just ignore them and always say that truth will prevail in the marketplace, that counter speech will prevail. That's not necessarily true. And if you're a person of color or a powerless person, you understand that truth more so than a number of progressives who preach a gospel like that, however justified. So here I'm playing devil's advocate a bit.
Oh, good. Thank you, Ron.
My sparring partner here.
First of all, Sandy, you described one of the two really important provisions of Section 230, right, the basic immunity, but it's really important to remember the second part as well, which also provided immunity for platforms which engaged in good faith content moderation in an effort to keep off various kinds of objectionable speech, even if that speech is constitutionally protected. So the point was to try to give free rein to and encourage these companies to create online communities that would be free of offensive, violent, racist, etc. speech that would create an unpleasant environment and therefore deprive certain people of the free speech opportunity, right? If they feel that they're going to be subject to racist speech, they're not going to use these platforms. And it is true that there's too much hateful speech everywhere, but please let's not lose sight of the enormous amount of pro-racial justice, pro-gender justice, pro-human rights speech on the internet, on social media that has just transformed the world positively. Black Lives Matter really did not take off until the advent of social media in a big way. The Me Too movement really took off based on the social media platform. How many candidacies of unknown first-time candidates, people of color, women, people without means, how many of them would have been successful without the relatively low-cost availability of social media? And so let's not exaggerate the downside. Now, with respect, if we got rid of, and I'm happy that we're talking about reform, because there is a lot of reform that could be done, but I think it's really important to keep in place that basic idea that the platforms should be open to third parties, and we should discourage excessive gatekeeping, right? We don't want to go back to what we had before the internet, which was broadcast media, very, very few of them. Even with the development of cable news, it's still very finite. Newspapers, it's very hard, even for political candidates, to get their messages across, let alone, I mean, it's very expensive to do it, let alone for everyday people.
Well, Nadine, since you've mentioned it, there's a very powerful piece recently in Slate proposing some ways that the internet could be, I know the word regulated is a very loaded word, but things that could be done to improve the circumstances on social media. And I realize, as you say, that there have been many progressive causes advanced by the internet, but we do hear, I would say, at least several times a week about some pretty horrifying things on social media, and including QAnon and some of the outrageous conspiracy theories. But in this piece from Slate, the first point suggested was that Congress could modernize federal criminal law by prohibiting some of the most egregious forms of online speech. Now, to you, that must be a little bit frightening.
No, it's
the notion of prohibiting speech, online speech, egregious forms. Who will decide what's egregious? What will the standards?
I don't think that, I think I read that same article, but be that as it may, whatever the article said, I would support what already exists, which is enforcing existing federal criminal law with respect to online speech, as well as with respect to offline speech. So, for example, targeted harassment that interferes with somebody's exercise of their own free speech rights, as well as privacy and other fundamental rights, is as illegal online as it is offline. And there have actually been successful both criminal prosecutions and civil actions brought against online speech. I would not advocate creating new classes of unprotected speech just because they are taking place online. And in fact, law enforcement officials have opposed expanding the category of illegal speech online because they say, for example, with respect to hateful speech or extremist speech or terrorist speech, that it actually helps to monitor people who are engaging in those communications, to intercept any plans or any coordination to undertake actual illegal activity. It doesn't help to drive these people underground in a way where their planning and activities cannot be monitored by law enforcement.
So a couple of things.
Ron.
Nadine urged us not to exaggerate, to kind of look at the benefits that the internet and the social media have brought us, and not be blinded by those benefits, or not to ignore those benefits. I agree entirely, but I think there's another side, and that is in many ways, not always, but in many significant ways, social media has played a vital role in the deconstruction of truth. If you doubt it, look how 70 million Americans voted in this last election, all right? There is a huge divide in this country about basic facts, about what is true, about the role of science and what have you. Now, did social media create that problem? No, but it certainly accelerated it in a very significant way. And to kind of be, to ignore these sorts of dangers, again, I don't know what the answer is, but I don't want to deny the fact that this is a real problem, that you cannot talk to somebody who's of a different political party affiliation and agree on basic facts. I mean, just demonstrable facts. And so I think, this is a cultural problem more so than a legal problem. And I think it's a cultural problem that goes back to what Neil Postman wrote in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985. And that is when you have a highly capitalistic culture that is highly dependent on advances on the algorithms of the new technology. And you put those things together with the trivialization of truth. He wrote in 1985, what you have is the current administration. That's exactly, and you have the current division you have in the United States. I think Postman was enormously successful in foreseeing exactly where we find ourselves today. And as I said, this is really a cultural problem more than it is a legal problem. We can kind of go back and forth about Section 230, but it exists against the backdrop of this huge divide in this country about basic things.
2 points, though, Ron. First of all, I really object to what I heard you say, and please forgive me if I misunderstood you, but I heard you imply that everybody who voted for Trump did so because they believed lies and falsehoods. And I don't think that is a fair generalization at all. There are well-informed people who strongly disagree with a lot of values that are very important to me. But based on those values, they voted for Trump, not because they believed lies. And, you know, that kind of exaggeration, I think, leads to the contributes to the unfortunate polarization we see. But the second point you make, which is the really fundamental one, is we have cultural problems here, and we should not blame the media, which reflects, and sure, it can amplify the bad as well as the good. But taking a message off social media is not going to take the idea out of people's minds, and that is what we really have to deal with. We know
that's true, Nadine, and that many heinous ideas may go underground if they're not tolerated above ground, or if they're not listened to. But there is, what you're both pointing to is a tremendous divide, a social tension, cultural tension, political tension in this country that has I think in some ways it's not unfair to say that it has been fanned by the internet, and that content moderation on the internet is a very spotty thing. And we all know that some of the platforms get much more vigilant after there's been public complaint about what they haven't done. And it's been, I think it's worrisome to some people that it's left in the hands of private profit-making organizations that may not have the First Amendment written on the wall of the content moderators. And I guess the question is, I'm going to just go right quickly to one of the questions that's come in from Renee Murray, who tells us that she lives in a retirement community in Florida where Fox News seems to set the tone. And she's wondering whether President-elect Biden is going to take the opportunity to reinstate some whistleblowers who were forced out under the Trump administration to make a point. General Vindman, as an example, some other people who have been treated particularly badly. I know this is taking us back to a different issue, but will the Biden administration use the opportunity you could argue it has to set the record straight that dissent is actually okay? Dissent within government is sometimes quite useful. What do you predict or expect on that score, Ron?
Well, let me just attempt to first offer a line for the defense in terms of something Nadine pointed out. I don't have any reservations about critiquing the Obama administration on certain issues, and I don't have any reservations about critiquing the Trump administration and supporters of each of those administrations. I have no problem with that at all. I think that if you doubt that there's a division in this country when it comes to basic facts, watch one night CNN or MSNBC, and then watch at the same time Fox News. And if you look, Fox News now may be losing out to Newsmax and One American News. I mean, already those stations, which Trump has asked his followers to tune into those stations because Fox isn't treated the way he wants. But if you really want to see a difference in the way people and their political parties think, look at the ratings on those respective television stations and look at how, should it surprise any of us that if you go to MSNBC night after night after night, COVID, 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 go over to Fox and see what you see. Go over to Newsmax or One American News, all right? We really are facing a situation where people look at facts and process facts to the extent that they're relevant at all, radically different. And so I don't know if this speaks to the issue.
I didn't deny that, Ron. I just said that does not explain everybody who voted for Trump. And your point underscores that it's an underlying societal problem that's reflected by all media, not just social media, including the traditional media. Renee, I think you have a terrific suggestion. I don't know if the Biden administration has made any such suggestion, but if not, I urge you to get in touch with them. I know there are ways that they're seeking ideas from the public. I think that's a great idea.
President Trump didn't hesitate to pardon a lot of people who were convicted of crimes. This would be less than that on the part of the Biden administration to just change the public perception of some of these people who worked for the government, who've been virtually labeled traitors by, if not specifically by the president, and it would be one way to turn things around. There's another question from Vincent Zhang about some of the comments that were made before about riots or about some of the protests, some of the violent protests. And Vincent points out that Martin Luther King defined riots as the language of the unheard. Mm-hmm. And that he said, although he said they were ultimately destructive and self-defeating, but they were indicative of a system, perhaps, where some people were simply not being taken account of. I think there would be an argument for some Black people to say that they've tried to work through the system, and it has been difficult. And now some of us who defend free speech as vigorously as we do are asking them to listen sometimes to some vile speech, to give it credence, and that some people might feel it's not working, and so they get very frustrated. So what do you say to Vincent's point about all of our condemnation of riots and violent protests? Are they not understandable in a certain context?
I think it's so emblematic of Dr. King, who was so amazingly compassionate and empathetic toward everybody, including those who were exercising violence against him, in addition to those who were exercising violence in support of the causes he championed. And he continued to stress that the most effective way, right. And it does have a demonstrable track record, which is why, of course, we have a long way to go, but we have to take cognizance of how very far we have come through peaceful advocacy, through law reform, through litigation. And, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was already mentioned by Ron, unfortunately died, but her legacy as well is a testament to how much can be accomplished incrementally, which may be frustrating, but it really can bring about changes that are revolutionary within a short time. So I would say, yes, maybe we should be forgiving of those who feel a rage, but I think we should try to persuade the vast majority to exercise peaceful avenues for achieving change. Right. They're much more likely to be successful and persuasive.
The trouble, as with so many things, is finding the path through all this that promotes positive change, but tells the truth about some of the sins of the past. Ron, did you have any further thought about that?
I think, remind me of the person who made the comment.
Vincent.
Oh, Vincent, I think you're spot on, and thank you for bringing that point out. I think to kind of echo what Nadine said, certainly it was part of the character and caliber of Dr. King that he recognized and understood that even violent action and destructive action, one can understand what gave rise to that. but he time and again went out of his way, even when it cost him a division in the African American community with those who were calling for armed resistance. He continued to advance the cause of peaceful protest. And I would just say this: First Amendment law as we know it today, including New York Times versus Sullivan, would have been impossible except for the contributions that the NAACP did in those peaceful protest cases. And we must never forget that. And I think, now that more than ever, we see the importance of those freedoms that they brought to us. So
and in fact, in terms of success, Sandy, you alluded to this earlier. Public support among white people, all kinds of people, not only in the United States, but all over the world, just skyrocketed for Black Lives Matter over the summer. But then as there were more and more incidents of violence, the support decreased.
Well, we don't know that Black Lives Matter was necessarily responsible for that violence.
Oh, I'm not saying that they're responsible for the violence, but unfortunately, people make that guilt by association leap. And especially when there are certain politicians and media commentators, Ron, that try to perpetrate that narrative.
Speaking of the culture wars and some of the cultural differences in this country, what do the two of you see lying ahead on, well, if campuses ever come back together and become functioning communities, which they've had difficulty doing during the pandemic. Do you foresee a calmer time on college campuses? Nadine, you have spoken quite a bit about cancel culture and how upsetting you find it to be. I do want to point out to you that cancel culture comes from both sides. Our Free
ends
Speech
of the
Project.
spectrum. I always point that out, and if anybody wants chapter and verse, take a look at the website of FIRE, which is the host of Ron's terrific blog, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They regularly list examples from both the left and the right, whoever has political power in a particular community. So everybody has a stake in making sure that, now it's a delicate issue because people have a free speech right to advocate anything as long as they do not engage in intentional incitement of imminent violence or law breaking. So if somebody says something that you think is wrong and evil, you have a right to advocate for that person to be fired or to be kicked out of school or whatever adverse punishment you're seeking. So here we're talking about what the culture should be, not what the law is. And when people cross the line from criticizing ideas and seeking to defeat ideas that they consider dangerous and evil, to eliminate life opportunities, and including the opportunity to continue speaking to a person who is voicing an idea they dislike, that's very dangerous because that leads to a pole of self-censorship, which is now, I'm continuing to speak on campus virtually, Sandy, and I can tell you, I hear this constantly from faculty members and administrators, as well as students. Public opinion surveys confirm it. The Cato Institute, together with YouGov, did a survey that came out this summer that showed that 62% of all people in this country do not publicly discuss certain ideas about politics for fear that they will be subject to tangible economic reprisal. And that was true of Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals. What was really concerning from the academic point of view is the fears were particularly strong among the young people and the most well-educated people. In other words, those who were on campus, who had recently been on campus, which shows that on campus, they're learning how to self-censor, not how to engage in robust free speech.
Well, my experience on the campuses where I've worked recently is not quite that, doesn't indicate that it's quite that simple, but I understand what the polling data show. I think that the right side of the political spectrum has been more effective at exploiting this situation.
Absolutely.
And claiming cancel culture is an issue than the left has been. And there have been some pretty egregious things on both sides. I will agree with you. But I mean, the campus in Georgia not so long ago where a Latina author visited and spoke about her views.
Oh, they burned it.
And her books were literally burned afterwards. And that is a symbol that is so powerful in the history of Western culture of the last X number of years. The burning of books with presumably dangerous ideas in them. And that was done by conservative students at a public university in Georgia. And I think one has to keep track of across the political spectrum what's happening and hope for an opening of minds much more substantial. Ron, I'm sorry.
Yeah, since I have no disagreement on that score, let me stick to cancel culture, and if I can, turn the heat up a little bit. There was a news story that appeared yesterday by Glenn Greenwald, and it concerned a new book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And one person, after reading that book, and I'm quoting verbatim here, stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is 100% a hill I will die on. Again, stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is 100% a hill I will die on. That statement was made by Chase Strangio, the ACLU's Deputy Director for Transgender Justice, and when asked about that, well, after it was on the internet for a while, it was taken down. He took it down and then said that the statement was just being cheeky. Nadine?
Ron, when I was president of the ACLU to this day, defend free speech rights of employees as long as they are making it clear that they are not speaking on behalf of the employer. And I didn't see that disclaimer, by the way, in Chase's tweets as far as I looked at them, but it seems to have been understood. I read Glenn Greenwald's piece, which I thought, was very, very critical of that statement, but made a very strong point of distinguishing that statement from the ACLU's positions. And it's very difficult to, in certain factual situations, to, on the one hand, say employees have a free speech right in their personal capacities to express points of view, including dissenting points of view about the organization's policies. From, on the other hand, at what point are they seen, whether accurately or not, as speaking for the organization and undermining its mission? But I think it's especially important for the ACLU to do our best to try to draw that line, because we're constantly telling other employers, including government and private sector employers, that they do not have total control over what their employees say when they're off the job in their personal capacity. And it's analogous to a situation about public schools, right? We've taken the position that schools should not do what they are doing, which is seeking to completely police and control and punish social media feeds by students or teachers 24/7, 365. That's going to lead to the complete death of free speech.
The suppression of free speech in high schools is absolutely appalling. But the notion that someone who works for the ACLU would even privately suggest that it was an essential priority to prevent the publication of a book with views that he regarded as objectionable is shocking.
It's scary. To me, it's shocking when we see those views expressed by members of the journalism profession, library profession, publishing, not to mention academia. All of these professions and sectors where we would expect people if you're interested in dedicating your life to that cause, don't you understand how essential robust free speech is? And yet, especially among younger peoples, it's being increasingly challenged. But that means that we haven't done a good enough job of persuading that free speech is important. I would say especially important for transgender and other sexual and gender minorities, and people in that camp have made that argument.
In the spirit of being a First Amendment provocateur, let me turn the heat up again. What if Chase had it right? I mean, if you look at the world as divided between free speech on the one hand and equality on the other hand, and how those two intersect, what if he had it right? What if he's right? What if he says, what if it's that this is demonstrable hatred being perpetuated against transgender people, all right? Why shouldn't he condemn it? Why shouldn't he say, make a statement, I'm going to do everything I can, all right, to stop any interest in this book. This is just the perpetuation of blatant discrimination against transgender people. I think, when we talk about free speech, remember, there's always a risk involved. It just doesn't give you a free pass. It just doesn't mean that people can speak their minds and that, somehow the truth, justice, and sunshine will prevail.
Nobody assumes that. That was one of the other points you made earlier, Ron. That is one of my pet peeves.
Okay.
I don't know that
Go for it, Nadine.
Defense of free speech depends on this naive view that the truth is always going to prevail. Absolutely not. And I think Holmes, the great skeptic, understood that it's just the least bad option that we have, that depending on the government or a social media company to decide what's good speech and what's bad speech, what's true speech and what's false speech, what's dangerous speech, etc., that is even worse than trusting the so-called marketplace of ideas.
Well, the marketplace of ideas is probably the strongest metaphor in free speech. We don't have to believe it in toto, but Holmes also was more than willing to recognize that the experiment can fail. And as he mentioned, in a number of opinions in Abrams and in Gitlow, if it failed, if it just all imploded into tyranny, Holmes was fine with that, all right? And that's
if you look at history and you look at present reality, the experiment with censorship has failed. When we had more wide-ranging censorship in this country, you better believe it was LGBT.
You're a great expert
censored, right? Even out of the federal mails.
You're not going to get me to come to the defense of Eugene McCarthy. It's not Eugene, of Joseph McCarthy.
A common mistake. Ron, you're a great expert on Holmes, and I have tremendous regard for what you've written about him, but I don't actually think that Holmes would have been satisfied if tyranny had prevailed. I think that Holmes would have thought...
Go ahead.
I think that Holmes would have thought that somewhere along the way, you had to interrupt the free flow of these ideas, perhaps, or do something. And that's what I was just going to ask Nadine. Is there no moment at which we would have to intervene? What if we found ourselves in the position of Weimar Germany, which used to be unimaginable, but after some recent experience is not so unimaginable? I see the Proud Boys in the streets doing exactly what in DC this weekend.
That's exactly the problem, Sandy, and that was the problem in the Weimar Republic, which I've studied intensely. My father was born as a so-called half-Jew under the Nuremberg laws in 1922 in Berlin. And I've just, read the latest history of the Weimar Republic. And the problem was not that there was too much free speech. There wasn't enough free speech. And there was too much violence that went unpunished. By the way, hateful speech, including by prominent Nazis, was published, and the Nazis used it as a propaganda platform.
Oh, of course
and by the way, that book that Chase was saying he would like to burn, I had the reaction that I'm sure a lot of other people did. I bought the book. It enhanced my interest in the book. It was not a protest. It just really made me curious to see what did this author actually say. And that is one of the many reasons why, no matter how well-intentioned the effort to suppress dangerous, hateful ideas by censorship might be, it at best is not an effective way to counter those ideas. And at worst, it actually helps to perpetuate and amplify them.
Well, I hope we don't come to that test in this country. I think we're in a very volatile moment right now where there are people ready to say quite disturbing things.
And there are so many people who are responding, and we have to draw the line at not letting them engage in violence. And unfortunately, there is a lot of concern that's been voiced at various levels of law enforcement that they have not been getting enough resources to fight against domestic terrorism.
Well, I think that's true. I think we've seen that's true. And in fact, one of the explanations for that is that the preoccupation with international terrorism amounted to not additional resources, but a transfer of resources.
Yes, yes.
Especially within the FBI, away from looking at domestic terrorism.
But that's also happened at the local levels as well. That would be a positive change that the Biden administration could foster.
Greater attention to domestic terrorism. In the local and the federal level. Let's return to that question of mine from before, Ron. What do you think the Biden administration could do to improve the condition of free speech and our safety at the same time in these next 4 years?
Let me just speak to that question in a moment. Before the clock runs on us, I want to say something. I think it's important. If you want to appreciate the value of free speech, and you want to appreciate the reason why we defend it, all right? Listen to Nadine Strossen. One of the things I enjoy about being a provocateur with her is that she rises to the challenge.
Rise to the bait, you mean?
No. Seriously, I'm being entirely serious.
Yeah, thank you, Ron.
I agree. She is a standard bearer.
My defense is not being sycophantic. I mean it very seriously. These are tough questions. And it's
very tough questions.
Precisely because freedom of speech is so valuable, and it's precisely because it's so risky that we need people like Nadine, who for decades has been defending it with I think important answers. And so Nadine, we've long been provocateur, or I've long been a provocateur, and every time I go the rounds with you, I end up losing. But that means that the First Amendment prevails, and I think it's a better day for it. And so I just want to thank my friend Nadine.
Well, the First Amendment is good with us. Now, what can the Biden administration do to make it even better, Ron?
So kind of to echo some of the things that have been said, including by some of our listeners, I think a clear policy on whistleblowers, all right? And now you have to remember them, that, as they're thinking about this, they're going to think, oh my God, there's going to be some Trumpsters.
I have some ideas.
There's going to be some Trumpsters in the various agencies, and are we going to allow them to have their say and what have you? But I'd like to think that the Biden administration will be different than the Obama and Biden administration, and different than the Trump administration. So I think some clear rules about that. I would say that if they're going to tinker with Section 230 at all, they should think maybe more about transparency and other things. I'm very hesitant, despite the fact that I've been a bit provocative about it, about any changes being made to the law. I think that's important. It's very important who the Solicitor General is and how that person, what their perspective on free speech is. It's something that we don't tend to think a lot about, but I think that's very important. Look what the current administration, the various sides it's taken in the cases before the Supreme Court. So I think Solicitor General is another important area. And finally, I think setting a tone of civil discourse about differences, about being simpatico to different ideas, and to echo what Nadine said about not demonizing people who have different ideas. I think that tone, which really goes to the culture of free speech, which is essential. I think those are some important things that the Biden administration can do.
I think those are great ideas, and I thought that Biden's initial speech a week and a half ago, was very positive when he talked about ending the demonization. There are a number of executive orders that Trump has issued that have negative ramifications for free speech
Right.
that it would be very good for Joe Biden to revoke on early in his administration. Ironically, one had to do with protecting campus free speech, which sounds very
Right.
good.
Well,
And yet, it had an impact that definitely could chill free speech. Even more recently, he said he was going to issue an executive order. I think he hasn't yet done so, and based on a commission that was going to prescribe a so-called patriotic curriculum for
right.
schools and dictate the appropriate way to teach about racial issues, as opposed to he threatening to withdraw funding from schools that teach the 1619 curriculum. And, again, I think legitimate criticism and debate about 1619 and other curriculum is appropriate, but to have the federal government even threaten to withdraw funding or to issue an executive order has an enormously chilling impact on free speech and academic freedom where it's most important.
Well, thank you both very much. We're out of time and it's dark in the room where I'm moderating this discussion now, creating a slight horror movie effect, I think, on Zoom. But I do appreciate very much your thoughtful and energetic participation. I'm grateful to people from around the country and perhaps the world who joined us. I'm sorry there were other questions that we didn't get to that we had set out for ourselves, as well as those presented by our other participants. But we will come back to these subjects and perhaps all together at another time before too long. Thanks to all who joined us, and good night.
Thanks to everybody. Take care.
Take care.